LBJ's real grasp of history was political history. He remembered what happened in 1949 when China was, quote, lost to the communists. And there's no doubt, because he made it very clear, he feared more than anything else that the right wing, as he put it, you've always got to watch out for the right wing, he said, would look at what they perceived as his weakness in Southeast Asia. And that the who lost China debate and Joe McCarthyism and all of that would happen again on his watch. But, you know, there's another factor. And to be fair to Lyndon Johnson, all of us are the product of what goes before. Lyndon Johnson became president, remember, amidst dire circumstances, following the death of a glamorous, much-loved, eloquent, Harvard-educated president, all the things that Lyndon Johnson wasn't. And before that, Dwight Eisenhower, a global hero, the man who won World War II, matchless credibility on military and other matters. The fact is, both those presidents had, to varying degrees, committed this country to Southeast Asia. Today, it's easy, with the benefit of hindsight, to say, you know, Mr. President, to Lyndon Johnson, if only after your victory in 1964, you had made the difficult decision to pull the plug. Or, if you decided we're not going to pull the plug, you made the difficult decision to escalate the war to the level that many in the military thought could produce victory. But Lyndon Johnson chose a middle course. He remembered Korea. He remembered the police action. He didn't want to run the risk of bringing China into the war or Russia into the war. He didn't want to run the risk of starting a third world war. So his approach in Vietnam was, in effect, a restricted war, a limited war. Slow, steady escalation, increasing the pressure through the bombing, in particular, beginning in 1965, but interspersed with frequent halts in the bombing and public indications of a desire to negotiate a settlement. One final thing about, and that's the personal history. All of us have a personal history, and presidents are no different from the rest of us. Lyndon Johnson believed that he could negotiate a deal with anyone. And he had every reason to believe that. I mean, look at what kind of success he'd enjoyed in the United States Senate, as a Senate Majority Leader, for example. He used to say, if only I could get in the same room with Ho Chi Minh, I do believe we could negotiate a deal. Lyndon Johnson's tragic flaw was he didn't know, and by no means is he alone. I don't mean to single him out. He didn't know enough history. He knew just enough history, but not enough history. He knew the history of Munich, but he didn't know the history of Vietnam, or Southeast Asia, or nationalism, as opposed to communism. And in the end, well, you all know how it turned out. Perhaps the most unfortunate legacy of Johnson in Vietnam, something that impacts all of us to this day, is something called the credibility gap. In 1964, there was the Gulf of Tonkin attack. Now, people are still debating. You know, history's been called argument without end. There are historians who are still arguing over whether there was an attack in the Gulf of Tonkin. Believe it or not, 40 plus years later. The best evidence that we have is there was one attack, not two, as suggested at the time. It turns out several years later, the cable traffic was re-examined, and believe it or not, human error, it was mistranslated so that folks in Washington, with the best of intentions, believed that there in fact was a second attack by North Vietnamese gunboats on American ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. In any event, LBJ seized upon the incident, whatever it was, to validate and formalize his newly aggressive policy. There was never a declaration of war, as you all know, in Vietnam. This came to be seen as a substitute. But it also began the long unwinding of American credibility and indeed popular belief in what the president was saying. The idea that you could have guns and butter, the idea that the casualty lists that were being released week after week after week bore any resemblance to what was actually happening on the field, the growing discrepancy between the optimistic reports coming out of the White House and the pictures. After all, seeing is believing. The pictures that television was bringing into our living rooms. The fact is, Vietnam is the first living room war. And more, by the 1960s, presidents, the most powerful men on earth, they're not the most powerful men on earth. They are responding to outside forces. They are responding to pictures, particularly television pictures, much more than they are manipulating those pictures. And in the Johnson presidency was planted unintentionally the seeds of pervasive distrust and even cynicism, exacerbated by Richard Nixon and Watergate, which I would argue have never really gone away and are with us to this day. Johnson used a typically pungent analogy to convey his plight. He said, if you have a mother-in-law with only one eye and she has it in the center of her forehead, you don't keep her in the living room. What did he mean by that? Change the subject. His great hero, of course, was Franklin Roosevelt. Let me wrap up with FDR, because FDR is held up to by many as the quintessential wartime leader. It should come as no surprise that even FDR was a man who felt hamstrung in many ways. Wednesday, June 5th, 1940, was an unhappy day at the White House. The President of the United States was monitoring a full-scale Nazi assault on France and chafing against the constitutional and political restrictions on his freedom of action. In the state dining room, 50 young men and women were sitting waiting for him. Their expectations of FDR were as rigid as the straight-back chairs they occupied. Urged on by his wife, Roosevelt had agreed to take 3 hours out of his overcrowded schedule to meet with this group of youthful idealists. It was what diplomats call a frank exchange. The young people were harshly critical of the president for his shift in priorities away from the social concerns of the New Deal to those of national defense. As one hostile question followed another, FDR retained his habitual mask of patient geniality. He took refuge in history. 80 years earlier, another wartime president, Abraham Lincoln, had confessed plainly not to control events, but to be controlled by them. Now, as Hitler's armies threatened to plunge civilization into a new dark ages, Franklin Roosevelt asked one outspoken young critic whether he had read Carl Sandburg's recently published epic biography of the 16th president. Told that he had not, Roosevelt administered a gentle, if unmistakable, verbal spanking. I think the impression was that Lincoln was a pretty sad man, said FDR, because he couldn't do all he wanted to do at one time. And I think you will find examples where Lincoln had to compromise to gain a little something. The harassed president went on to describe Lincoln as one of those unfortunate people called a politician, whose realization that he couldn't get it all at once, and here FDR paused to interject, and nobody can, was the source of his persistent melancholy. Nevertheless, said the president, by concentrating on what was possible, Lincoln had managed to get a great many things for posterity, for which posterity was grateful. Maybe, he concluded, his young questioner, quote, will make a much better president than I have. Maybe you will someday, but if you ever sit here, you will learn that you cannot, just by shouting from the housetops, get what you want all the time. Roosevelt, on another occasion, said this: it is a terrible thing to to look over your shoulder when you were trying to lead and find no one there.